here, and we're recording. Hey everybody, welcome to Unbreakable Radio, episode 3. I'm super excited to have my friend Tucker Graff on the show today. And we're going to talk a little bit about powerlifting, a little bit about mental health, and hopefully a couple other exciting topics. Tucker and I met, I want to say about this time last year. He participated in a fundraiser that my friends had for me when I was recovering from my hip surgery, and so just kind of my first impressions were really nice guy, really cool dude, and has a lot of really important opinions about weightlifting and strength training that are maybe a little unconventional from the common narrative. And so I'm just really excited to have Tucker on the show today. How's it going, dude?
Good, man. How you doing?
I'm pretty good. I think one thing that I was been kind of curious about is, what got you into lifting in the first place? Kind of you're a very accomplished powerlifter, so how did you find interest in the sport or interest in strength training in general, and kind of what's led you up to the point that you're at now?
Yeah, well, so first of all, thanks for hyping me up and saying, very accomplished powerlifter. I still think I am overall not very strong at all, so that is nice to hear. But so what kind of got me into lifting to begin with was I was one of those, kids in high school who just not very athletic. I did sports kind of because you were expected to do them, not really necessarily because they were something you enjoyed. If I had had my choice, I would have just stayed inside the house and read and studied and done other stuff instead of doing sports. And that's fine, but, small town where you grow up, you're just kind of expected to do sports, and so that was something that I felt I needed to do. And so what I ended up doing was I did cross country for 4 years in high school, and I wrestled for 4 years in high school. I'm not overly great at, it was something that I thought I enjoyed at the time, and then after high school ended, it just all kind of fell off, and I stopped doing it. And it was fine for a few years until I started working full time. And then you sit at a desk, 8 hours out of the day. You start to get a little achy. You're hunched over. Your back starts to hurt. Just things along those lines. So I started boxing, and I boxed for a few years, and I really enjoyed that. And then what actually ended up getting me into lifting is kind of that stereotype that everybody has. Had a relationship fall apart, and somebody told me to start lifting. So I went in and I started lifting, and just kind of took off from there. I met a few people at the foundation, which is where I had started lifting at. I met, Lucas Dudgeon, Muhammad Al-Khalaf, Mitch Vespestad, the John, people like that. They were all part of K-State's powerlifting team at the time. And from there, I kind of just switched from lifting for enjoyment into that powerlifting aspect of it a little bit, and ever since from there it's just kind of taken off. So
rock on. I think that's so true. Maybe like you said, maybe it's a stereotype, right, to get into lifting after a breakup or something hard, but I do think that for myself and for a lot of people, I do think that the gym, the world and situations can be pretty good at making you feel like shit. And so I think the gym is a really nice place where you can go and do something that helps you feel good about yourself, or that helps you maybe kind of reaffirm some of those senses of self or self-confidence that we can lose during a breakup in particular, or during life difficulties.
Well, it is a stereotype, but it's a stereotype for a reason. It's because you don't go to the gym by yourself. There's always a crowd of people there, and when somebody's upset about something, what do you do to feel better? You go get in a crowd of people and distract yourself from something, whether that's running or lifting or something like that. I mean, it's a stereotype for a reason. So.
Right, absolutely. And I think you touched on something else too, which is it's personal development, but it's also about building a social community. I think we're social animals, and I think as much as weightlifting and sports like that can seem like individual sports, I think the individual doesn't excel without kind of being integrated into a community of others.
Mm-hmm.
What did you study at K-State, or are you still studying at K-State? Kind of what brought you?
Yeah, so I've taken kind of a roundabout path to where I'm at now. So for reference, I grew up in a small town in western Kansas on a farm, And the only thing I knew when I graduated high school was that I did not want to farm anymore. So I went and I studied history for a year. I was going to be a teacher for a year. And then I ended up settling on civil engineering. And I studied civil engineering for about 3 years. I had about a year left in the degree. And I just hated it, did not enjoy it. But I knew some people who worked in civil engineering, and I ended up getting a job. And my opinion at the time was, I was like, well, I'm just going to work in this field for a couple years, see if I enjoy it, and then go back and either finish the degree or, switch to something else. And at the time when I decided that, I think I was 22 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up liking the fact that I was making money so much that I did not go back to school.
Sure, yeah.
So I didn't go back until I was 29. And so what I'm majoring in now is feed science. And so what that is, it's basically the production of animal feed for, livestock or pet or anything like that. And I'm actually going to be, this is fairly new, but I'm going to be getting my master's next year too. And we're going to be doing it with an emphasis in extrusion and kind of food science. We're going to be studying insect meal in human and animal food, using it as a protein source to replace some of the, because right now we use a lot of grains for protein source in human and animal food.
Sure.
And it's not overly healthy. So there's a lot of research being done to replace those grains with insect meal instead. So yeah, so I'm excited about it.
Yeah. So someday are we gonna be like having our post-workout shake of like crickets or like mealworms? Or I've seen
honestly people we joke about it.
Yeah.
We joke about it. There's markets over in Africa where people will go buy their daily protein for the day, and 50% of their consumed protein is insects.
Wow.
And it is cheaper than it's cheaper than traditional livestock form. I mean, it's funny to joke about, but it's real. I think it's going to be something that'll be pretty big in the future. So.
I've had, I've eaten, I think like one time I was visiting, my dad lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I was visiting him, and at the farmer's market, there was a whole booth, and they had like granola bars and like snack bars. Like they had a whole insect-based like product line because of that. What's the, is that in terms of sustainability and production, are insects like a more sustainable option as well, in addition to maybe being a little bit healthier?
Yeah, it is way more sustainable than traditional livestock. So you look at, for beef cattle, the amount of water and land and feed that it takes to produce like 1 kilogram of consumable meat is it's astronomical.
Yeah.
But if you're producing insects for protein consumption, I think it's half of the resources needed for a kilogram of meat from poultry. Whoa. And poultry is like a fifth of what it takes to produce a kilogram of meat of beef. So, I mean, it's just the resources that you have to take are just much, much lower. It's much more economical. It's much more environmentally friendly. The problems with it here, at least, is not necessarily the production of it itself. It's more cultural attitudes, legislation attitudes, and the production of it into food, because we're not really sure how it'll interact with other ingredients when you combine them into things and stuff like that. And the legislative aspect of it is actually a real pretty touchy subject, because we have all those animal welfare laws that dictate how you have to treat animals that are produced for food.
Right.
All those laws specifically exclude insects.
Interesting.
Which you don't necessarily think about animal welfare when it comes to insects. And I mean, there's an argument that you maybe shouldn't have to because they're insects, but at the same time, it's part of the food chain. You do want to make sure that everything is regulated from top to bottom. So there's a lot of groundwork to be done on, a lot of research to be done, and I'm pretty excited for it.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, that's really cool. And I think it's also got me thinking, like, with your civil engineering degree and with researching this and like thinking about the integration of like, food is really political, and then like food production and supply, and then like, ecological sustainability. All of these things really tie into health. And I know, like, maybe we're, I think I'm probably, as a trainer, more interested oftentimes like in the lifting portion and whatnot. But I think, we take in the kinesiology department at K-State, there's a lot of discussions on, public health and how like food accessibility and food production, and then, even like built environment into play. So I'd be curious. Yeah, I just would imagine that you've probably got a pretty broad knowledge base and a lot of interesting thoughts or kind of concepts around like food production, and then health and activity and the built environment with civil engineering. It seems like that's like you've got like quite a combo going on there. That's like a really thing.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna go off topic here real fast, because you mentioned food production, and this is something that I'm not necessarily super educated in the food production of just general human food. But I do know a little bit, and it is interesting to me when you look at how, our food production has changed from 1950s on to how that correlates to the obesity crisis in America.
Right.
Because, coming out of World War II, food companies had so much processed food that they were creating for soldiers going overseas that had to be able to last for a long time. And instead of shifting away from that and getting back to what we consider normal food, they just started selling that to us instead. And as a consequence of that, the amount of time that we spend in the kitchen every day cooking has gone down. And there is a pretty direct correlation. As that time has gone down, the obesity rate has gone up. I saw a study the other day, I was reading one, and it said that, the average American spends, I think it's 27 minutes in the kitchen every day, which to me is just mind-blowingly little. Like, how do you cook?
Yeah, right.
That's like, it takes 27 minutes to cook one meal. And
absolutely.
It does not surprise me that the obesity rates have gone up. And we tie that, like, we're all about convenience on everything now. Even if you look at things such as like how we make our bread, we mill grains into white flour, and we use white flour for everything. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we use commercial yeast along with that to make bread. And I feel like that partly, there is some research being done on how that has contributed to the rise of gluten intolerance.
Sure.
Celiac disease has been traditionally 1% to 2% of the population, but you have vast swaths of the population now claiming gluten intolerance.
Right.
And it's an interesting theory to think about, is that because they're eating really just bread that is just not very nutritious anymore? Or because, it used to be, the first bread that was ever made was sourdough bread. It was just dough and water that was left out, and it fermented for a week, and somebody was like, let's eat this and see what happens, and they started making it more often.
Well, and there's almost like a probiotic component to as well, like at that point too, right? And I think like exposure, because I worked at a coffee shop here in town, and I remember we had a bakery manager, and she had like no family history of allergies or like anything like this. And then after like 5 or 6 years of working around flour every day, she would get like rashes on her arms from contact with flour. And it was like an acquired allergy in that time that was dermatological even.
Yeah, no, it really is interesting, because you look at, bread for thousands of years was 3 things. It was flour, water, and salt. And look at how most bread products are made now, and they have so many different added things. And I'm not one of those people who will sit here and tell you that stuff is bad, because I think that stuff has its place. We fortify a lot of that stuff for nutrients, for minerals, and for preservatives and stuff like that. But I feel like we have kind of gone too far in that one direction, and that shouldn't be the majority of our diet. And you look at that with, even like you were just saying, that flour thing. It's they grind it, they sift everything good out of it, where it's just the endosperm, and they they bleach it. I don't necessarily know how good that is in the long term for a lot of things.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's an interesting topic that I'm not very educated on. I like to read about it, but
Yeah, same. Well, I think it was just something like, yeah, it's a conversation like public health or whatever, and like, yeah, processed food. Those are common conversations, but yeah, there's a real nuance that it kind of got me thinking about, like just with your skill set and your history. I also think I agree with you, right? It's like, I think, we have two camps of like only all whole foods all the time, always, or people that are like any processed food is like absolutely fine. It doesn't make a difference. And I'm definitely more somewhere in the middle of like, you don't have to be phobic of like a compound in an ingredients list just because it's something that you struggle to pronounce. But it's also like, yeah, there's got to be balance there as well. And to be too reductionist, I think, on their side is like pretty myopic. Which also, I think like you look at not only have, like body composition changed over time, but like psychiatric well-being and like all of these things. And like there's some research on like inflammation in the gut and like, again, that's something that I don't know a whole lot about. I couldn't, quote you literature at this point in time, but that's like a conversation that I see kind of like starting to crop up, which is, yeah, how does like chronic inflammation or like gut health impact like psychiatric well-being or like, our neurological system, which then impacts kind of like our mental and emotional state as well. I know that's something that like dealing with this arthritic hip this past year, like I've never really had anything where I've been, maybe had like a canary in the mine shaft to like acute inflammation, but I definitely notice now like the way that I eat, like if I stray away from eating primarily whole foods or I like drink alcohol or what have you, I notice my like pain levels change dramatically in response to that. And it's almost been, kind of like a revealing thing. Because I think when you don't really have anything that makes you like feel bad, it's pretty easy to just like, eat whatever you eat and then be like, yeah, it's probably fine. I don't know, so it definitely makes me wonder about that. On that topic.
No, it's interesting.
Oh,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. I was gonna say, sorry, I think we froze a little bit there.
Hey, Annie, I think I lost you for a second there. Yeah, you're all right. What's going on?
I was gonna say, like along those lines, I know that one thing we kind of talked about prior was a lot of people train and are like, this is my therapy. Like on the lines of like mental health and nutrition and all of these things, like how to kind of segue. Like I know that we've talked about, therapy is therapy and training is therapeutic but not therapy, and I'll kind of curious to hear your thoughts on that stuff.
Yeah, no, so this is kind of a sensitive topic for me.
Sure.
Because you really saw this a lot when the pandemic hit. There was a pretty broad group of people who just, the gyms being closed was the end of the world. And the argument was always, well, I do this for my mental health. I do this to stay sane. I do this for, endless amounts of reasons like that. I do this so I don't go home and drink a 12-pack every night, things like that. And it just, that to me, that's such a faulty argument because it's the gym. Like this, it's just the gym. If you need therapy, the gym is not therapy. Go to therapy. Therapy is, working through your problems, talking to somebody, finding the root cause of something, and actually addressing whatever those issues are. Whereas the gym, I can understand why they think that because, again, it goes back to that stereotype of why you got into lifting to begin with. Sure. You go to the gym, you lift, you get a rush of endorphins, you feel better. Over time, you get a little bit bigger, you get a little bit stronger. And you start, that just compounds, you're almost kind of addicted to the gym.
Yeah.
And that is an issue. And I don't think that's, I don't feel like that's a very healthy way to consider to look at lifting at all to begin with, because, what do you do if your entire mental health is wrapped up in this one aspect? What do you do if you suffer a catastrophic knee injury?
Yeah.
You can't lift anymore. Are you now a weak person because you can't lift? And right. It's filled with this, this kind of pseudo masculine culture of, lifting to be strong, lifting to be, a man, and all these different things, all these just really problematic ideas about what lifting does for men. And at the same time, while they're going on and they're telling you, don't be a bitch, go get under that weight. Don't be scared of it. You can squat it. At the same time, they're too scared to go talk to somebody about their feelings. And I'm like, you can't, I don't think a lot of people in the gym see the disconnect there. And to me, it's the other reason why I got into lifting at the time, and this is going to get a little personal, but my brother had died in 2016. My older brother did. It was pretty unexpected. And it was one of those things where, at the time, I was not a big proponent of therapy or anything like that. And lifting helped. I'm not ever going to sit here and tell people that, lifting is not good for your mental health, because I do think it is. In the end run, I do think it helps. But it was one of those things where, I would be upset or sad. I would go lift. I would feel better for about an hour. And then it just kind of turns into that feedback loop. And it doesn't really address the problem. It addresses the symptoms. Lifting or exercise in general can absolutely be, part of a mental health plan, but it can't be what you're using for your mental health. And it just, it just turns into this almost kind of overprivileged thing, to where you have a bunch of middle-class white people bitching that they can't go to the gym and talking about how sad it makes them. And I'm like, just go for a walk.
Pretty weak sounding, like from a
it's very weak sounding. It's just, how fragile are you if that's what it takes to break you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You've touched on.
Oh yeah, that's therapy. It feeds. I don't feel. Yeah, I feel like lifting is great for mental health when you look at it as a whole, but it also has these little pockets where it's not great for your mental health at all, because you get a lot of dudes and women who are wrapped up in making progress and seeing the weight go up on the bar, and they don't understand that progress is not linear. It ebbs and it flows, and you're going to get stronger, and you're going to have periods where you're a little bit weaker. And when they're in that lull, when they're in that valley right there, they are just the most miserable people to talk to, because their entire mental health is dependent upon the fact that they are constantly getting stronger. And it's just really not. I don't feel like there's enough education about that, and I don't necessarily know how you would even begin to research that and outreach to people about it, but it's something that I see every day, and it just bugs me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think you touched on a lot there. I think, first of all, thank you for being vulnerable and kind of sharing, your experience with your brother. I think that's like you said, it's it makes you feel better for a window of time, right? Which has its value. But it's almost it's the equivalent of having a significant injury and taking pain medication to mask it, right? It's it's not addressing the underlying thing, which is grief or maybe trauma, or all of these things that really only therapy is able to address. I think you also touched on something else where you talked about kind of more masculine culture, and it's really interesting, I think, to hear your perspective as a man, because it's as a woman who's been in the gym for 13 years, and then also my exterior gender identity presentation has changed over time to kind of align more with how I feel, right? And as a masculine of center woman, it's something that's kind of interesting to almost bridge, almost stand a bit on the border in terms of my social spheres that I hear these two things from. And I feel like it is a fully gendered thing almost, right? So it's with men, you hear this kind of culture of it's you're afraid to talk about your feelings, but then in the gym it's hey, don't be a pussy, right? And it's really all of these things are kind of built on, there's a bit of a self-loathing underlying that, or of a feeling of not being good enough. And then I think on the other side there's this kind of feminine equivalent, which is the stereotype of oh, you've got depression, don't use medication, you should just go to yoga. instead. Or, you know what I mean? Like, I think we almost have these like gendered things, which is like, okay, like, and I love powerlifting, and I think that yoga is also wonderful, right? But it's like, it is almost gendered in terms of these exercise or physical movement modalities as like a replacement for, you know, seeking mental health care and seeking like treatment. And I do think that like you said, the gym can be a companionable thing. I think it can be a place where we can gain self-knowledge, which is a useful thing to bring into therapy, or, you know, social community, which is also like integral to our mental well-being. But I think also, like, if that social community is reinforcing things that are not healthy for you, then that also is maybe like a little bit questionable too. I'm kind of curious to think, like you said, you know, I'm not sure how you research this, or you know, it's something that you see a lot. I think that in a way, like, just by like living by example, right? Like, you know, you're having like a conversation with your bro, and it's like, oh yeah, dude, I go to therapy. I think that sometimes like being like how you are and like living in that environment is like a way to change the culture, almost just by like setting an example. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I had a question at the end of that, and now I've lost it.
No, I know what you're saying. I do know what you're saying. Like, this actually, I do actually kind of have a relevant little story for this, because I was at the gym the other day, and one of the guys that he's always just there at the same time as me. He just started lifting, and he started asking me my opinion about something. And he had read this article that talked about how lifting reinforced toxic masculinity. And he brought it up in kind of like this joking way about, you know, how, can you believe this bullshit article that I read, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, they kind of have a point, man. Like, they really do. And it's not even necessarily, you know, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this in a way. Go on Instagram and look at any of the people who have gotten big over the last year, in the sense of pushing back against their gyms being closed due to COVID, or, you know, arguing for gyms to be opened, things along those lines. And, you know, there's an argument to be made that gyms don't necessarily need to be closed because of COVID if they take the proper precautions, because, you know, I'm not even going to get into all that. And there's a whole business economical aspect of it. There is an argument to be made either way.
Sure. Yeah, it's nuanced, but
yeah, it is nuanced. But their arguments are not dependent upon that nuance. Their arguments are all, you look at any of the things that they post, it is about, you know, real men doing men shit, or, you know, men don't take, like, like free men, not slaves, and stuff like it's dependent upon this just borderline irrational, just not based in reality at all language of what a man is. And you can even look at that in the apparel clothing that gets advertised to us on Instagram. I was browsing Instagram the other day, and I saw this one. It was like wolves, not sheep, or something like that. And I'm like, I'm not either. It's just a shirt. I'm just going to squat. Like, it's not.
That's the thing to me, I think, that's always comical. I've seen that, yes, that branding as well. And the thing to me, like, it also falls in line. Yeah, this is so integrative with like the mental health discussion, which is like, there's all these like false equivalency things, which are like, I'm a warrior, like I'm a lion, or I'm a, you know, like, it's like, you know, some badass middle school sport mascot stereotype thing. And it's kind of like, dude, you're not like a lion because you went and benched today. You're like a human with remote car. You drove to your air-conditioned or heated gym, and you like wore your clothes that somebody else probably made for you for like very little pay per hour. You know, it's like we really until we want to like ego stroke about, you know, it's like, you're not a soldier. Like, soldiers are soldiers.
I know.
And you're a weightlifter.
Yeah, that's that whole. What is it? They not to dump on any nutrition brand or clothing brand or anything in particular, but like, you always see that hashtag dues paid, and I'm like, you didn't pay any dues. You just went and lifted. Come on, that's not.
Exactly. Yeah.
You went to the gym.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I absolutely feel the same way. And I think it also, like going back to almost like some of the fragility of that type of masculinity is that it's like, if you have to feel like, in order to feel good about yourself, you have to tell yourself you're a lion. That's like actually kind of a sad way to like derive your self-confidence. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I would rather feel good about myself based on like other maybe more meaningful things rather than like what I consume. And that kind of comes into, I think, also with like consumer culture and like advertising and whatnot, and how those things like impact us and influence us, and in the weightlifting world, but also like, in our well-being. I think one thing that's interesting too is like, and this is something we talked about with Cassie last week, is, I got my degree in kinese, but I did a minor in the gender and sexuality studies department. And everybody, I think, on both sides for a period of time was like a little bit perplexed of like, why are you majoring in this thing and like, minoring in gender studies? And I think it's one thing for like somebody like me to observe, hey, that's kind of reinforcing toxic masculinity. Like, the weightlifting world at large is like not going to listen to what I have to say, you know what I mean? Like, in the way that they'll listen to what you have to say. And so I think it's cool for you to like take that stance, because it's probably difficult to a certain extent. And I think one thing that doesn't get talked about enough too is like, okay, yeah, there's these articles on like, yeah, toxic masculinity and gym culture, but I sometimes wish that the argument was reframed with like, toxic masculinity is harmful to the like men that feel like they have to embody it as well. And it's not like saying that all masculinity is bad, or that like, being masculine is a bad thing. It's saying that like, it's okay to go to therapy. It's okay to have feelings. It's, like all of these, more feminized ideologies. It's like those aren't, we don't have to have this like false dichotomy that like being emotional or like being vulnerable is like weakness. And that actually that's like a pretty brave, strong thing to be, which falls in line with maybe some of our traditional concepts of masculinity. Like maybe it's more masculine to be like brave enough to like go talk to somebody, right?
Yeah, well, and that's that nuance. Like, everybody, you always say the words toxic masculinity, and you lose half of the room immediately. And it annoys me, because it's just a complete misunderstanding of what the term even means. The term, there's nothing wrong with being masculine. If you want to grow a beard, if you want to be stoic, if you want to be, one of those guys who pseudo lumberjack, wears flannel everywhere, stocking cap, the strong silent type, if that's who you want to be, that's fine. There's nothing inherently wrong or problematic with that. The problem with that comes when you take that and you go, that extra step too far, and instead of just being the strong silent type, you are now the type who ignores your feelings, who ignores all of those things. And that's where the toxic part of it comes in, because that stuff doesn't just go away. You can't just bury what you feel about something forever and expect it to go away. That's how you get long-term problems like depression that comes up. That's how you get anxiety. That's how you get domestic abuse, all those things. And it's interesting to circle back a little bit on the powerlifting aspect of it. I was reading the study, which I'll have to look it up and send it to you. I cannot remember the name of the guy who did it, but he was a pretty high level doctor, and he worked with a lot of athletes. And it was something like 80% of the athletes that he had worked with had some form of mental health crisis, whether that was, suicidal ideation or depression or just in general crippling anxiety. And to me, 80%, that is a massive.
Yeah, staggering, right? Yeah.
I don't get, percentages for mental health, but I would assume it's not 80%.
Right.
Like, to me, that's just ridiculous. And there's a link. Yeah, I would hope that it's not 80% the gen pop, but there is a link, I think, between people feeling powerless in that one aspect and trying to do something that makes them feel powerful, but not really understanding how that reinforces the mental health issues. It's like, it's like the figure competitors in women's bodybuilding.
Absolutely.
They have I don't know how many of them have eating disorders, but there's always a couple, it seems like, who just, years after they retire, they open up about how many eating disorders that sport gave them. And that when you're looking at them when they're competing, because, they look, quote unquote, what society says is fit, what society says is healthy, things like that. But I mean, it's just really damaging to their mental health. And it's just one of those kind of things that just kind of sits underneath the surface and nobody really talks about it. Nobody really knows about it. And I feel like it takes a lot of people kind of by surprise once they get into it a little bit more. And they don't really understand how it was, I don't want to say it was preventable, but, it could have been mitigated.
Right, absolutely. And I think that kind of ties into too, like this idea that what we're doing for sport or bodybuilding or weightlifting, like that there's a dichotomy between, because the commonality with those is like exercise and nutrition, right? But then it branches off into like performance and sport and aesthetics and general health, and that they're, the way that you use exercise and nutrition as tools for performance and the way that you use them to, mitigate disease or to feel healthier or, to live a longer life, that those aren't necessarily the same. I think especially like you mentioned with women's figure competitors, not only with like eating disorders and body dysmorphia, but I think also, like hormonal conditions, pharmaceutical use. I think that there's not a lot of honesty about, kind of what's happening there too, because it's like, if you're like, not to be like too into the physical health side of it, but like, if you're not menstruating for like 30 years because you're starving yourself and every time you eat a slice of pizza, you feel suicidal or filled with self-loathing because, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then you've like, your hormones.
I know exactly.
It's like your hormones have been jacked for 30 years. Like you might be at a higher risk for endometriosis or for, like really severe physical problems, but you've spent your whole lifetime with, like telling other people like, I'm healthy, like I look healthy, and our culture really like glorifies that. And it's like, women aren't necessarily like built to have 10% body fat year round, and that's becoming like super normalized. And I think, even as a trainer, like, sometimes people come in and they say, okay, I want to lose weight, or they show me pictures of like, I want to look like this. And it's like, okay, well, a lot of the things in your life that you enjoy are going to have to fall away in order for you to like neurotically chase, this look or whatever it is.
Yeah. No, you talked about body dysmorphia. I don't know a single person who lifts consistently who doesn't have some degree of body dysmorphia.
Absolutely.
Every single person I know has that to an extent. We just met a year ago, so you didn't really meet me when I was tiny. I was about 155-ish pounds when I started lifting.
Wow.
About 216 now, something like 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I still, when I look in the mirror, I don't see 215 pounds. When I look in the mirror, I see, 150, 160 pound kid.
Yeah.
And just every now and again, there'll be that moment when I'm back home visiting my family or something like that, and I'll see photos of myself next to my dad. And then I has that moment where you see it and you're like, oh, no, I am not that small kid anymore. I am, 215 pounds or something like that. There's a vast difference. And it's just one of those things. I think it's because, you look at yourself in the mirror every day, you don't really see the progress that you necessarily make.
Totally,
but
yeah.
Every single has issues like that. One of the girls that I trained, I bet her legs have doubled in size.
Mm-hmm.
Over the last year, which is great because that's what we were trying to do. She needed to put on leg size.
Yeah.
Ask her, her legs to her are the exact same size that they were.
Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. Well, that's something I think for me, myself included, I think like you said, those things that like, I don't compete like in a figure thing or whatever. And so I don't really, it's not like a chronic part of my daily life, like body dysmorphia. But I think having had like traumatic injury and having like, I've got a lot of scar tissue, and that like, I've got like an area on my left hip, right, where like all of my skin and body fat on like one leg is like pushed into like one kind of concentrated area. And then, I think like you see yourself like, you know, in the hospital, like, you know, you see your body and you're like swollen and you just like lose all of your body, just like eats its muscle mass in like the matter of a couple weeks of full bed rest. And I think like sometimes training, you know, while largely it's like good, yeah, every now and then it's like I'll look in the mirror and I'll still see like you said, like you still see the 155-pound kid. It's like I'll still see like that version of myself in the hospital that looks like sick or has like no muscle or looks useless, and kind of some of those things. And I think it's like, you know, you keep, you know, I think like you go to therapy and you keep it kind of, you do your best to keep a healthy relationship to that. But yeah, myself included. And I think that like anybody, I don't know, I don't want to say everybody, maybe there's people that don't, but I almost want to say like anybody that works as a coach that says like, no, I don't struggle with that. Like I kind of feel like that type of dishonesty, I think people think that they're being strong or like selling their image. And I really think you're like kind of hurting people when you do that, when you're like deceptive about, you know, the reality of the situation for a lot of people, or the reality of the situation of what it means to train for health versus sport, along those lines.
I think the absolute worst thing that happened to the fitness industry in terms of the overall health of people in fitness was Instagram.
Yeah, seriously.
Honestly.
No kidding.
Because it was great for a marketing perspective. For people who need to make a living from that and market their services and advertise, fantastic tool for that.
Sure.
But even just in powerlifting, you know, you look at strength levels of people. An 800-pound squat is a ridiculous squat.
That's insane. Yeah.
That is a ridiculous squat. You go on Instagram, you will see people as far as the eye can see squatting 800 pounds. And it really kind of puts things in kind of an unrealistic perspective of, you know, well, look at how many people are doing this. How come I can't do this? And it's not good for mental health. It's not good for realistic in the sport. You look at bodybuilding, you know, there's so many people on Instagram posting bodybuilding, you know, progress photos, things along those lines. People start comparing themselves to them. Well, you don't know anything about that person. You don't know what pharmaceutical regimen they're on. You don't know what their family athletic history is like. You don't know what their nutrition is like. That person who you're talking about sitting there, you know, he's so big and jacked and ripped, he may literally freaking eat until he throws up every day. You have no idea what you have nothing, you know nothing about their life. And it's just, it's to me, Instagram is great for, you know, I use it as a progress log, but I also intentionally post almost every workout I do. And I do that for a reason. It's because there is a lot of habit of people posting highlights. And to me, when I go back and look at, you know, my progress over the years, I don't want to see that one time that I felt 130% and I benched, you know, 315, the absolute fastest that it's ever moved. I want to see how it moved every single day.
Yep.
And it's just that feedback loop of people posting just the highlights of their lifting and then comparing those highlights to other people's highlights. And I mean, you know, America's a big country. Powerlifting is a big sport. There's going to be a lot of people who can squat 800 pounds.
Yeah, your talent pool is huge. So like, of course, there's going to be, you know, your opportunity to see more outliers is going to go up. Yeah.
Exactly. But if everybody could do it, it wouldn't be special. It wouldn't be a benchmark. And I feel like Instagram has made that stuff to where people just expect themselves to be able to do too much. And they expect themselves to be able to.
Yeah. No, exactly. Sorry to cut you off there. I think
you're fine.
Yeah, like you said, people expect way too much of themselves, and then it's like you, rather than having realistic, like measurable, progressive expectations of oneself, it's like, oh well, I'll never squat 800 pounds, so why don't I just like stop doing it? And I think, you know, it's like comparison is the thief of joy. And one thing that I recommend to my clients sometimes is, you know, like unfollow stuff that makes you feel like shit. Like, you know what I mean? Like if every single time you can pick up your phone and look at it 6 times a day for 20 minutes at a pop, and you're like only looking at people, and every, you know, like the voice in your head is like, oh, I'll never look like that, or oh, I don't look like that, so I'm not good enough. It's like you have power to like just, you know, disconnect from that and curate. Like you don't have to see stuff that makes people feel terrible. Not to, and I mean, like, okay, that goes into like, it's not that it's good to live in a bubble, but like if you're only following folks that are making you feel terrible, like maybe like back off a little bit, right? Yeah. One, I think.
No, I know exactly what you're saying. It was one of those things because I mean, like, you know, there are a few powerlifters that I follow. Like I follow John Hack because that guy's just an absolute freak of nature, and it's impressive to watch. But you know, there are a ton of powerlifters in Wichita. There's a ton of them in Kansas City. I'm not friends with any of those people. I have passing familiarity with them, you know, from being at the same meets as them. I don't follow them because I don't need to see their day-to-day lifts and compare their lifts to my lifts.
Yeah.
And, you know, you extrapolate that to everybody in the country. I just don't need to see that. That's something that I think, you know, it just wears down on you after a while. And I do think people need to be of who they follow and only follow people that you're actually going to get something out of.
Right. Yeah. Value, right? It's like,
so, you know, I tend to follow, yes. So I tend to follow people who have the same body proportions as me because I can go in and look at their lifting and kind of look at how they're doing to my lift. It's just little things like that. I don't need to follow some random lifter from Hawaii. I mean, there's no benefit to me there.
Exactly. No, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I don't think it's a bad thing to say that. And I don't think, you know, people, I was going somewhere with this when I started this. People love to talk about how this is you know, it's a healthy sport, but I don't really think it is, you know, either physically or mentally. And I feel like Instagram to me has brought out some of the mental drawbacks to powerlifting. But even just physically, it's not an incredibly healthy sport at all. You know, I don't know a single powerlifter who doesn't have a nagging injury. Every single person I know has a nagging injury. And that's just kind of expected. It's not, you know, you look at any of those old West Side guys, they've all had hip replacements. They've all had knee replacements.
Yep.
It's just not healthy.
You wear your
you know, yeah, you blow your back out, you blow, you know, the three most common injuries in powerlifting are pec tears, bicep tears, and like a quad tear or something like that, or hamstring tear. And I mean, that's not healthy. That's really not. And even just in terms of general health, I am kind of curious if there's any relation to health later down the line in terms of how powerlifting affects our blood pressure, because we do brace really hard and you get a lot of pressure in your head. And you look at some of those guys who have nosebleeds, or they're bleeding, you know, from just wherever on their face from bracing. Yeah. And it just, to me, that's not the healthiest thing. Even I'm not what I would consider big or overly strong. But when I hit 200 pounds, I had to get a CPAP. My sleep quality got so bad from being that big, I guess you could say, that I had to get a CPAP. And that's not healthy. It is absolutely not healthy.
I think about that a lot because it's like super normal it's very normalized. And I think more for men just because there's like oftentimes a larger physical structure element there, right? But like the amount of men that I hear about in the industry that are like healthy looking, right? Even if they're big and they're like reasonably lean, that have sleep apnea, right? And it's like it's weird to me. Like I think to the rest of the world, like if I had no history in lifting and I came into this culture and I was like, all these people are obsessed with getting huge and everybody has to be on oxygen at night. Like that's like Yeah, it's strange, right? And I think also like times, like how many times do you see headlines of, you know, powerlifters or, you know, competitive strongmen, and I, you know, not maybe like folks like yourself, but like really big, like the you know, kind of headlining like world record guys. You know, how often do you see headlines of them like dying in their 50s and 60s of cardiac deaths, you know? And to me, it's like kind of strange that that's normal. And, you know, even like when I take clients on, I hear, you know, I'll take clients on and we'll start coaching and they'll be like, oh, are we not going to squat, bench, and deadlift right away? And I'm like, are you going to be a competitive power lifter? Well, no, but don't I have to squat, bench, and deadlift like, you know, like competitive barbell style lifts all the time? I'm like, no. Like we're going to train you to move like a human first. And if you decide you want to do powerlifting, like maybe we'll do a competition at some point. But, you know, to do that day in, day out from the time you're really young to the time you're old, yeah, I do sometimes wonder like what is the long-term cardiac adaptation and other adaptations too, right? Like bone and joint issues that aren't taken care of.
You know, this is purely an opinion-based thing, but when people ask me my opinion on lifting for health, I tell them the absolute worst thing you can probably do is barbell squat, because it will wreck your shoulders over time. And if you are not careful and squatting correctly, it can mess up your low back and it can mess up your hips.
Yep.
And I do kind of firmly believe that for general population, using a safety squat bar and squatting to a box is probably healthier.
Yep.
But you don't see that anywhere. You are always told you have to low bar squat. And just most people sitting at a desk, I would say most people sitting at a desk do not have mobility for it.
No, it takes a lot of like, you have to seriously want that and like be dedicated and have like a lot of, I think like multiple high quality professionals taking care of you in terms of like a good coach, maybe a good manual therapist, right? Like all of these other things. And then on top of that, I think part of the popularity of it, like, you know, I have clients do it, some clients do it, but not a large percent, maybe 5 to 10% of my clients barbell back squat. And, you know, for myself, that's been the thing that's been the toughest to return to with like injury, you know, kind of like traumatic injury stuff. And then on top of that, I think it also ties back to like what we talked about at the beginning, which is like the machismo element of it, right? Which is that like, well, you're a wuss if you don't barbell back squat. And it's like, I'm not a wuss. I just like don't have to have a double hip replacement if I don't have to. And I don't have the time or the money or really like the desire to put the time in to gain the mobility or to seek out manual therapy or what have you, to ensure that I can have longevity with this lift and really pursue it to like its fullest extent.
No, I mean, that's absolutely right. And it's one of those things, you know, I do a hard barbell back squat workout, and I feel like powerlifters and just people in general get too wrapped up in the feeling of being sore after a workout.
Yeah.
And how long it takes you to recover. Because I do a barbell squat, back squat workout, and, you know, it takes me 3 to 4 days before I would feel comfortable squatting again.
Right.
I could probably squat to a box with an SSB bar every day or every other day.
Right.
It's easier to recover from. I don't think that the stimulus is any less. I don't think you're getting anything less out of it, but it's a harder movement. So you use less weight and you can recover from it faster.
Right.
And that's not necessarily the priority for a lot of people in the gym. Their priority is to not, you know, do the minimum effective volume or what they can get away with and still make progress. They want to do the maximum weight that they can do on the lift.
No,
it's just not super healthy.
I'm such a believer in like minimum effective dose on training volume or training intensity, right? And it's like, okay, if we need to do more, we'll do more. But like, if you're making a solid rate of progress and you're not in pain and you're not so sore that you can like continue to enjoy your day-to-day activities, then like that to me is a win for like a gen pop person. To transition a little bit, just because we're getting a little close on time, I know that, you know, one thing that you're passionate about and one thing that we talked about last week with Cassie is, and something that's been, you know, maybe socially relevant in our world recently is this conversation on trans folks and their inclusion in athletics and strength sports and sports in general. I know that you have some thoughts to share there, and I kind of wanted to hear, like, yeah, what you have to share about it. And it's something that I keep seeing, like Roger Marshall, not to be too political, but like Roger Marshall, like in Kansas politics, if
I know.
you're familiar, yeah, he recently put a big post up sharing an article related to
He did.
the recent executive bill. And so, yeah, it's just like a hot topic right now. And I wanted to hear, what you had to say.
It's just such a non-problem. Like this is such, and I hate, and I'm gonna preface this by saying I realize that I'm gonna feed into this a little bit by talking about transgender people in sports, but I hate that this is the discussion most of the time, because that, the sport, the right for them to compete in sports is such a minor part of the conversation. First of all, transgender people are such a minor part of the population to begin with. There's just not very many of them. There's more than we think, but there's not near as many. They're a minority. And, we're talking about all these things about, whether or not they should be allowed to compete in sports, whether or not, how to make it fair, all this other stuff. And it's missing the fact, that there are a lot of places where people are scared to come out as transgender because they think they will be killed, or, they won't get employment, or they won't get housing or anything like that. And it to me, this kind of distracts from that a little bit. But it is also, as you said, the controversy of the time right now. So you do have to address it to an extent, because you can't let them control the conversation.
Right. Exactly.
And to me, it's just a non-problem. It really is, because first of all, the arguments against including transgender people in sports always go one way. They only go when it talks about a man transitioning to a woman and competing in women's sports. Nobody cares when a woman transitions to a man and competes against other men.
Right.
Nobody cares even when it's just a woman competing against men. We had women in wrestling in high school. Nobody gave a shit.
Yeah.
And if she won, if a guy beat her, nobody thought, oh, well, of course she needs an advantage from being a man. And nobody made a big deal about it when she beat him. I mean, his friends maybe gave him shit because they're 15, 16-year-old kids, and kids are mean.
Yeah.
But, like, there wasn't any of that gender language or anything about it. And it's so specifically the issue with, I do understand there is nuance to this topic. There is some context that, there is an argument to be made for somebody who's lifted his whole life until, say, 30, 32, 33, and then transitions to a woman and goes to compete. He is going to have a competitive advantage. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing to admit that. But how rare is that going to happen? That is not what most people do. Most people now do not 30 to 35. That is a decision that they make earlier, or it is something that they just never do. And the argument against including them is kind of based in those gender expectations of, you walk down the street, and you see a transgender person, you're not going to recognize them as a transgender person most of the time. They're
right.
just going to look like whatever they present as. But you even see like those stupid political cartoons about the gendered bathroom issue.
Right.
Remember? And it was always like some big burly dude with chest hair and a skirt trying to get into the woman's bathroom. And that's not
an accurate representation.
No, it's not. It's not an accurate representation.
Yeah. And I think,
like the high school thing specifically.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, go for it.
I was gonna say the high school thing specifically. Like, those kids that sports are, and I say this as someone who did not really like sports in high school. Sports are important for a lot of kids, and the right to feel included is important for mental health. And it's, the average male to female transgender person is someone who's probably been on puberty blockers for a while, hormone blockers. They're not going to really have that competitive advantage that people think that they will. And the argument against it is just based in just this general phobia and just honestly disgusting hate against other people. And it's not even realistic. It's not a realistic argument.
I think, one thing that you touched on, like, a lot of the times, like a trans girl in her high school is likely on puberty blockers. They're maybe like not even, high school, middle school, grade school, whatever, along the lines, like the gender differences in XX versus XY individuals in terms of, sports performance are not that different. And if you're on puberty blockers, you're likely, maybe even performing at a lower level than, if you have no low androgen levels, you may not have the same athletic output as like some of these kids that are kind of like currently going through puberty and having these like rapid changes to like soft tissue or bone density. And then like you said, I think something that I've been pretty fascinated by, because part of the argument is this idea that like if some testosterone is good, like testosterone more is better. It's this like kind of false equivalency that all testosterone levels lead to like all larger strength levels, and that there's a lot of research that shows that there's maybe some negative correlations in folks assigned female at birth with testosterone levels. And so I think that we get into abstraction, and like you said, like a lot of it just becomes based in hate, and then we don't address trans men, right? It's like, I forget his name, but the fellow that's the new face of Everlast, he won, I think, his first pro boxing fight, and nobody, is screaming about him.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
And it's like nobody's screaming about him winning, because it's like they don't see him as a woman, because they also probably don't even know that he's trans in the first place. And the phobia seems to really be biased in one direction. And I think one thing to me that I've also thought about is like, like castrosomania and intersex folks. It's like, okay, there was all this push for castrosomania to have to take testosterone blockers and to reduce her androgen levels. And at what point it's like, okay, in the sake of fairness towards everybody else, you're going to single her out and make her take drugs that are, her body's adapted to have a hormonal profile that's, maybe different than most, XYXX folks, but like it might be bad for her to take these hormone blockers, and then you're going to rob her of her ability to compete in sports. Like, how is that not cruel and not unfair, right? And I think then it comes down to, it's like, not to be too reductionist, but it does come down to just being like pretty hateful.
Well, society as a whole, for some reason, has this weird obsession with hormone levels. And I don't really understand why, because powerlifting doesn't have hormone classes. It has weight classes.
Right.
If hormones were the end all be all, how come we wouldn't get everybody tested and say, okay, everyone with 300 to 400 milligrams or whatever it is, levels of testosterone compete here. Everybody 400 to 500 competes here. Like, we don't do that.
Right. Yeah.
And
nor do we even probably know what
it
are. Like.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much variability.
Yeah.
There's so much variability, and I mean, hormones they're just not the end all be all that people like to think they are. And I don't understand why, when we're talking about a competitive advantage in terms of like castrosomania, specifically, she has higher testosterone levels than most other women I would probably say most women, or all women that she competes against, and that's fine. Nobody gave a shit about Michael Phelps being literally built genetically to swim.
Right.
Nobody cared about Usain Bolt having every genetic advantage that he had for sprinting. It's like, where do we draw the line between, having webbed hands and webbed feet versus having higher hormone levels? Like, both of those are a genetic advantage. It's not like Castor was born a dude and then transitioned at 32 and kept her higher hormone levels,
right?
And competed against women or anything like that. And even then, there's still a conversation to be made there, because you can take things that will suppress your hormone levels. To me, it's just this very, I don't understand how we got wrapped up in this so much. It just does not make any sense to me.
And it reminds me, like, the arguments that I hear from people on, against including trans folks in sports, a lot of the times, it reminds me of, like, the parents that have kids that, like, they think that they should be played, and the coach is like, hey, your kid's not, maybe the best, like, athlete to play for this position. And there's, like, an entitlement of, a lot of these parents of, like, well, this one trans, like, some full-grown trans woman is going to, like, come in and, like, murder an entire, like, women's sports team. And it's like, okay, look, like, maybe you let one trans girl play with her friends, and if your kid's not going to become, like, the next NFL player, like, they're not going to. And to claim that it's because there was, like, a trans kid on their team is, like, I think, a pretty weak argument. But also, I think it comes down to this idea of exceptionalism, right? Where it's like, yeah, nobody looks at Michael Phelps as exceptional because he fits a normative narrative for the most part, and then his difference is celebrated, whereas folks that don't fit, most societal norms in terms of, like, popular culture, you don't fit the societal norms, so there's, like, an exceptionalism thing of, like, well, you're exceptionally bad or, like, exceptionally dangerous for that difference, as opposed to it being celebrated. And it kind of reminds me of a lot of the arguments, like, there were similar arguments made about physical performance when we were integrating, Black folks into being able to play into professional athletics. Like, before that happened, there were a lot of people that were like, well, this isn't fair because of, and they were, like, trying to claim physical performance reasons. And it really reminds me, like, in the way that we look at those arguments as bigoted and antiquated, I think that, yeah, probably in, like, 50 or 100 years, we'll look at all of this and be like, wow, some people are on the wrong side of history.
Well, I really do feel too that, like, people that make this argument, they're conflating two separate things, right? They're conflating professional sports, which, yeah, okay, absolutely. If a male NBA player decides that, he's been ignoring this part of his life for his entire life, and he decides he wants to transition, and then he goes play in the WNBA, yeah, okay, he's probably going to have a pretty substantial competitive advantage. But he's also a male NBA player who's been playing basketball for his entire life,
right,
with the benefit of having all that additional testosterone. High school sports are not competitive like that. That's not what high school sports are. High school sports, everybody does them. And the broad population is not that talented in sports.
Right.
And when you talk about, some random person transitioning and then competing in women's sports and how that's going to break high school sports, I'm like, you just have the absolute worst possible view of high school sports to begin with. Yeah. That's not what high school sports are for.
Right. No, they should be for, like, personal development, community, like all of these other things.
Teamwork, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. I think also if we removed, like, these transphobic arguments, like, how many times, like, a while back there was controversy over, I believe it was Serena Williams having to take a hormone test because the optics, of it, they were like, well, she's too muscular. She must be, like, not normal or, like, on drugs or something. And I think it's like, if we remove some of these things and we had a broader understanding of how, like, hormones aren't everything, and we, like, got rid of some of that cultural obsession, it's like, maybe we could just, like, let folks like Serena Williams that are, she's the muscular, right? There's optics to it, but, like, rather than forcing her to go through additional hormonal testing, we could just be like, yeah, she's, like, super fucking good at the sport she plays, and, like, kind of leave it at that. I don't know, right? Like, drops.
And the argument is always based around testosterone. Always. And that's how you know that this is a bullshit argument. Yeah. Even in beef cattle, when we supplement beef to promote muscular growth, mm-hmm. I think we froze. Okay, no, there, you're back. Froze for a second. So even in beef cattle, when we supplement to promote muscular growth, we don't just supplement with testosterone. We supplement with testosterone and its synthetic derivatives, of course, but we also supplement with estrogen.
Yeah.
Estrogen promotes muscular growth.
Right.
And even beyond that, there's that whole thing of estrogen can lead to water retention, which can lead to better protected joints and let you recover faster or do more high impact things. Nobody talks about people with high estrogen as having a competitive advantage against the people who have low estrogen.
Right.
It's just testosterone.
Yep.
And that to me is that whole, it's just an argument that's based off of fear. And it's always based off of, oh, how are we going to protect our children, and specifically, how are we going to protect our female children? Because it's that gender bathroom argument, right? It's when they talked about, men saying that they identified as a female to go into a woman's bathroom and then, assaulting or attacking women in there. Well, okay, I don't know why you're saying that as a knock against transgender people, because your issue there is not with transgender people. Your issue there is with shitty men.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, that's not a transgender thing.
Which is like
that guy's going to do that no matter what.
Right.
It's just,
yeah.
So anyways, yeah. A lot of, and that's that, you brought the Serena Williams thing up. I think that's what happened with Castor to begin with. I think that's how that whole thing got kicked off. I think one of her competitors accused her of being a male, and they had to do a hormone test.
Yep, and that was the only.
And that thing.
Yeah. And I think it's like, how many of us?
She's never been there.
Right, exactly. No, she's just intersex, and I think it's like one of those things too. Like, how many of us I don't know what my hormonal profile is, or I don't even, I've never had like my genetics tested, right? Like, most of us aren't acquainted with our unique hormonal profile or our unique like chromosomal profile as well. So I think, absolutely. I think, lastly, as we kind of start to wrap up here, I think we talked a little bit about your programming and your coaching methodology and, kind of how you approach coaching. I know you said you kind of think about it as like a psychological phenomenon and that programming is like secondary to the athlete to a certain extent. So like, how do you approach that? And then I think we'll kind of follow up with like maybe what you're reading, watching, listening to, and then go from there.
Yeah. So, like I'm not formally educated in kinesiology or programming or anything like that. This has always been a hobby for me. It's a hobby that I really enjoy. And, as you can probably tell, the mental aspect of this hobby has always been kind of what has fascinated me the most. There are tons of people in gyms all across the world who just run something like 5-3-1, and they get very strong off that. There are dudes who don't program anything. They just go in and they max out every single day, and they get very strong from that.
Yeah.
So when I was looking at stuff like that, and when I was reading about that, programming is important to an extent. But to me, it's always been the psychological aspect of how to motivate people, get them to buy in, how to get them to believe in themselves, things along those lines. And, you even look at, there was a study that I was reading the other day by Greg Nuckols. He had summarized this study that was basically done, and it was all about steroids versus mental belief and things like that. And so what they did was they took a group of experienced lifters and they made all of them max out, and they said, certain group of you who, we're going to take some of you and we're going to give you steroids during the course of this study, and then 4 weeks later, we're going to max out again. And so they maxed out, they took a group, they gave them a placebo pill. Well, they didn't really give them steroids. They just gave them a placebo pill, and they told them that they were giving them steroids.
Sure.
Their maxes increased on average like 10%. And these were not newbie lifters. These were established lifters. Yeah, people who had been lifting for a while. And then the weird thing about it was when they told them that they had not been on steroids for the last 4 weeks, their maxes regressed to what they were before they were given the placebo pill, even though they had already lifted that weight and they knew they could lift it. So to me, that was really interesting, because that's that whole kind of mental, you trick yourself into thinking that you're capable more of what you can, than what you can do. So I don't charge for my coaching, and I only coach a few people at a time because this is a hobby for me. But it's very, the programming comes secondary to understanding the lifter and understanding what they need to succeed. So, I'm not going to name any names about them, but one of them, it's not that they need to be babied, because they absolutely do not need to be babied. It's more just, not everybody responds well to aggression. If somebody is bench pressing and it's 90%, there are a lot of coaches out there who, if that bar moves a little slow going up, they will just tell them, you need to push harder. You need to move that faster. It's 90%. You need to do better at that way. And the bar is going to move the way it moves. It's moving that speed for a reason. Sure. And so when I coach people, to me, it's more I try to look at it as a puzzle. The programming is generally pretty constant. We do a lot of conjugate training. And the reason why I like conjugate is because it allows for some auto regulation.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
On the day. If I call for you to work up for a 2-rep on a lift, whatever it is that day, that's just your rep max. It's fine, whatever it is. That's not necessarily what I'm looking at. I'm looking for, does that lift fold you over? Did it fold you over because you were stressed and you weren't capable of getting your back as tight as you normally were? Did it fold you over because you're not eating and you need somebody to gently nudge you and say, hey, you need to eat more carbs? Things along those lines. So to me, and it's not even necessarily the day-to-day psychology that I like. I really enjoy meet day psychology.
Yeah, that's
and how your attempt selection plays into your belief of yourself. If you miss your opener, how that can affect your ability to lift the rest of the day. Even though you've done all that work, you've peaked, you are strong enough to lift everything, if you have one bad lift, how do you get that lifter out of that hole and back into a place where they can perform at the level that they know they can perform at? And that to me is super interesting. But circling back to the program aspect of it, because I know already I'm going to have a couple friends push back on me about programming not being very important. You look at 95% of lifters, what are their weaknesses? They're weak off the chest on the bench press, they're weak off the floor on deadlift, and they're weak in the hole on squat. How to fix that? There isn't anybody doing programming anymore that is groundbreaking. We know basically how to fix the majority of weaknesses. And so, if I'm working with someone and they're weak off the chest on bench press, I don't need to put a lot of thought into it. I need to make them do long pauses, or I need to make them do photo press, or I need to make them do something like that. There's nothing there that's overly hard to program for. It's very much the psychological aspect of it. And so that's why we do a lot of conjugate, because if you do all the variations all off season and you're setting PRs with your variations, but you're not doing your competition lifts very often, then when you go to do a competition and you're doing your 8, 10, 12-week peak into the meet, they are setting PRs every single week.
Which is so good.
And even if they're not necessarily getting stronger during that peak, even if the peak is just laid out, illogical, and they're not actually being peaked at the end of the meet, they're still building confidence week to week by setting those PRs into that meet. And that alone is just invaluable, I think, for lifters.
Absolutely. I think,
a little bit different than how most people do it, I think.
No, you touched on a totally other value, because I think, with like powerlifting type stuff, I really like conjugate training as well. And I think, like you touched on auto regulation, I'm really big on like if you feel like garbage that day, like you might not hit a projected number or something, but that's your max for the day. And we're working within these auto regulated things. And it's like, you mentioned Greg Knuckles' research study with the placebo pills. And I really like a lot of the content he puts out through Mass, their research.
I do too, yeah.
And that's we're not sponsored by Mass. That'd be cool. That'd be super cool. But yeah, it's like there's so much on autoregulation, and I just feel like it seems like constantly we're finding out more and more that kind of like training around how you feel on the day, but not, I mean, right, like within a spectrum is kind of the way to go. And then I never really thought, though, with the variation, a lot of the times we think about the variation as like addressing different weak points or addressing different joint mechanics or like tissue, and it's really the movement element is focused on. But I never really thought about the psychology of doing these kind of like variant lifts until you're hitting your competition lifts, and just that the psychology of that transition and the kind of PR each week being such a beneficial psychological process.
Yeah.
That's really insightful. Thank you. That's super cool. Along those lines.
And it's just, yeah.
Oh, go for it. You're good.
No, you're fine. I was just going to kind of, it's powerlifting for most people. I feel like people tend to think of it in terms of a guy a lot of times, mm-hmm. where if he wants to increase his bench, what's the first piece of advice he gets? He gets told he needs to get bigger. Mm-hmm. And that's the goal of everybody. It's, one of the people that I coach, she's a 130-pound female. She doesn't want to get any bigger, and that's fine. But if she wants to increase her bench press, there's two things she can do there. She can either move up to a weight class, or she can get better bench pressing. And the variations are not necessarily hypertrophy based or anything like that. They're not really based in the aspect of trying to get her to put on mass. The variations that I pick for her are a lot of times variations that reinforce the technique cues or patterns that I want her to practice. Yeah. If she's terrible at pausing on her chest, I'm going to make her do a lot of long pauses just to reinforce, how to pause on your chest. Totally. And things like that. Board press, if she's terrible about driving up on that last portion of the lift, I'm going to make her do a lot of board press because it's a super heavy lift. And the only way that she's going to be successful at it is if she learns how to drive up and back. Yep. So, I mean, it's just, it's kind of that, I view it more as teaching than anything else, honestly. So,
yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, you had something you were going to say before I interrupted you.
I was going to say, along those lines, like even not in strength sports, like I do a lot of my programming, A, with autoregulation, but B, I kind of have this like, and I say this phrase a bit facetiously, but like, PR every day, which is that like, I've got a client right now and she's on a heavier strength block as, that's not purely powerlifting in nature, but we have a secondary lift, which is just like dual kettlebell floor press. And it was like, we started it at one weight for sets of 5, and she went at that weight, she went from sets of 5 to 12 over the course of 3 weeks. And it's like, okay, maybe could she have done 12 the first week? Maybe not. Maybe she could have done 8 or 10, but the psychology, like week 1, she did 5 to 6, week 2, we're, hitting 8 to 10. And then week 3, here you're hitting 12, and that psychology of like, wow, I've gotten better every week. And then we jumped up to the next bell, right? And it's like, again, we're doing, she's gone up in weight or reps every single week. And she's only doing it once a week for the past 8 weeks. And it's like, yeah, what is I think the psychology of just having at least one thing where you like come in and get better at it every time is like so good for the athlete.
And that there's a struggle there in terms of how people a lot of times measure their progress, because they tend to typically only measure it in pounds on the bar. And I think that's a really short-sighted way of measuring it. Because I mean, like you were saying, if you can do more reps at a certain weight, you are stronger. Mm-hmm. And if you do, heavy 3x3 and it takes you 30 minutes to get through, and then you do that same weight and rep scheme a week later and it takes you 20 minutes to get through instead of 30 minutes, you are now stronger because the time that it took to do that work is shorter. So yep. It's interesting to me how people tend to measure their progress and how wrapped up they get with specific numbers and being able to do specific things. And I'm like, you would probably get a lot more out of this if you just took 8 weeks and worked in the 70 to 80% range and just in high reps. And then, after 8 weeks went back and maxed out, and you'd probably be a lot better. So.
Yep, absolutely. I think that sometimes comes down to, I think a misunderstanding of this idea of progressive overload. I think people hear that the word overload has load in it, and they assume that always means weight. And like you said, it's like number of repetitions, number of sets, time is a variable, and time is a variable of like how long you're completing the workout in, but also like how long is your pause, or like how long is it taking you to move through the eccentric portion versus, the isometric or concentric in terms of like the position on the lift or whatever, and energy levels afterwards and stuff like that. I think to kind of wind down a little bit, you mentioned that you're reading stuff from Greg Nuckols. I see, a lot of research kind of from him, but what else are you reading in terms of, related to training or just anything we've talked about today? And then along those lines, like anything that you're watching or any podcasts that you're listening to that you think that we would all benefit from?
So, this is, like I said, it's a hobby for me. So my reading kind of falls off once school starts back up because I'm working and going to school full time.
Yeah.
But I'm reading a lot of Greg Nuckols. I'm reading a lot of Greg Nuckols stuff right now. I'm trying to get caught back up on a lot of the stuff that he's put out. I'm going back through the West Side Book of Methods, which there are some issues with that book. It's not written very well. It's definitely, it's not laid out well at all. And it's, it's one of those things, you use conjugate for your athletes a lot. The original conjugate method was made for people who lifted in gear and multiply gear. And so when I'm reading that stuff, it's always one of those things you have to kind of keep in context what they're talking about, and then how does that relate to a raw lifter?
Totally.
And how does that relate to somebody who does not use multiply? So I'm reading a lot of that. I'm reading this really interesting book right now because, honestly, I don't know a lot about transgender anything. That's not, lived in Kansas my whole life. That's something that I've not had a lot of exposure to. So I am reading this book by Tay Meadows right now called Trans Kids. It's being gendered in the 21st century. And it's all about, how you have sex and then you have gender, and how one of those is, we may not understand it as well as we like in terms of hormone levels, and chromosomes and stuff, but it is like, that is an objective thing. You either have, male genitalia or you have female genitalia, and then there's a spectrum in between, or you're intersex, but like, that is something that there's not necessarily component. There's a verifiable component there, whereas with gender is very much socialized, and that is that whole argument of, men do this, men don't play with Barbie dolls, women wear dresses, women don't do this, that whole gender aspect of it. So it's very much, it's kind of an analysis of how trans kids kind of defy those gender expectations and what problems that causes for them in their lives.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a heavy book. It's sad. Not gonna lie. It's a book that I've been reading very slowly because it takes a lot to read.
Kind of hard.
But it's good. And honestly, that's one of those things. That was one of those things, I got into a couple arguments with people about the transgender kids in sports. And it was one of those things I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to argue this,
probably read about it.
You need to be able to, you have to be edgy. And I also, there's friends, close friends who I've gotten into arguments in person with about this. And I'm like, okay, look, dude, though, but like, if you're not going to read about this, then I don't think that you're allowed to have an opinion on this.
Right.
Like, you need to educate yourself about it a little bit before you take a stand on it one way or another. So,
yep, absolutely.
But other than that, there's not a whole lot that I'm really reading. I am reading this book by Michael Pollan. It's called Cooked. And, it kind of tied back into what we were talking about with the processed food and, time spent in the kitchen and stuff like that. And he goes into a lot of, it's actually a really interesting book in terms of the psychology of food. Because, for most of human history, the question has been, who is going to cook? And the answer has always been, not me. It's like, somebody else is going to cook. I don't want to cook. Somebody else has to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But we all have to eat. And that answer, even though like that's what people always want to do, you just used to have to cook. Everybody had to cook to survive.
Not an option. Yeah.
It just was not an option. And now it is an option. And so it's kind of a look at how that is affecting society in certain ways. And it compares America to India, for example, because India still has a very robust, cooking tradition, home cooked meals, and Western, specifically processed foods, are trying to break into the Indian market. And so it's an interesting look kind of at, the effects that it's having on their society.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. Michael Pollan is such. I'll have to check that out. He wrote another book, I think, maybe called The Botany of Desire. That's on like plants that have shaped us. And then I read last year. I was gifted his book How to Change Your Mind, which is on kind of like psychedelics and like maybe knowing oneself, which is another field that I'm probably almost as interested in as weightlifting. And I'll have to read that. That sounds really, really fascinating. And
and actually I'll tell you this now, because I didn't find out about this till I got halfway through the book. That book's been made into a documentary and it's on Netflix. So you can just watch it instead.
Yeah. Oh, we'll have to check it out. I think the last thing that we've kind of been ending with, just to, I don't know, maybe tie it all together, is kind of like just asking the guest, like, what strength means to you. So what does strength mean to Tucker?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question, and I'll try to simplify it as much as I can. And most people, what strength means to them, powerlifter specifically, and I feel like they would probably throw, three numbers at you: a number for the bench, number for the squat, and a number for the deadlift. And I think that's kind of a really shitty way of looking at strength, because to me, it's not. Numbers are not reachable for everybody. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that, but if you have something that you want to do and you work at it every single day, that is strength. And that also goes back to the therapy discussion we were having. If all you're doing is lifting to fix your mental health issues, but you're not actually fixing it, if you don't admit that to yourself, that's not strength. Like, you may think that you're strong because if you have major depressive disorder, which I struggled with, depressed, and you go 8-9 years and you're still here, you may think, like, I've battled this my whole life, I'm strong for it. But that's not really strength. You're just resilient. And you're resilient in a way that you don't need to be resilient, because there are things that you can do to help yourself in that area.
Yeah, sure.
And that is, therapy, medication, and there's nothing wrong with being resilient. There's nothing wrong with being proud about that. But I feel like we kind of take pride in those things that we don't necessarily need to take pride in. We tend to create a struggle for ourselves, because humans have always needed struggle to define their identity. Like, nobody likes an easy existence. And to me, strength is, I guess where I'm kind of going with this rambly sentence is, strength to me is the ability to identify the things that you don't like about yourself, whether that's mental, physical, emotional, the way you communicate to people, anything like that. Admitting why that is the way it is, and then aggressively pursuing whatever you need to do to change that. And to me, that's just what it boils down to. It's, it's that whole argument between motivation versus willpower. How do you get motivated to do something? Well, you don't get motivated to do anything. Motivation is not real. Motivation is temporary. It's not permanent. If you want something, strength is just, having the willpower to chase whatever it is you want. Yeah. So that to me is kind of the way I always view that. So
yeah, awesome. Well, Tucker, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing all of your wisdom. That was probably the longest guest we've had so far. It was really exciting. And it's just been really good to talk to you and hear your thoughts and to get together. And thank you so much for being on the podcast. And I look forward to sharing this with other folks and continuing to connect over time.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me, man. This was fun. This is cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime, dude.